you very much for coming to this symposium on sanctioning human rights violations, Magnitsky Law from the World. My name is Ai Kihara-Hunt. I am an associate professor at the University of Tokyo at the graduate program on human security, but I also direct the International Law on Training, Training Research Hub, which is one of the organizers of this event. So we are organizing the event in cooperation with Human Rights Watch, and the research is conducted by the Human Rights Watch and the hub members, and it's co-organized by the graduate program on human security at the University of Tokyo and Global Studies Initiative, and funded by Global Studies Initiative. So without further ado, I would like to open this symposium. So Japan is in a discussion of introducing Magnitsky Law, following other countries that have gone before us. It is sanctions against individuals or organizations for human rights violations, abuses, or corruption. At this occasion that we are celebrating for starting this discussion on Magnitsky Law in Japan, it is a great honor for us to host this symposium with the world leaders on Magnitsky Law. I'm really especially glad that we can have top speakers, activists who pushed this Magnitsky Law in the US, Canada, Australia, Switzerland, and people in Japan who are now trying to push this Magnitsky Law to come to effect. For effective implementation of Magnitsky regime, it's important that many countries join this initiative, and this symposium, I hope, will be one of the initiatives to make people aware of this Magnitsky initiative and to push for the enactment of the Magnitsky Law. This symposium is in two parts. So one part is this session, that is session one, starting from 6 o'clock until 9 o'clock today, Japan time. And there will be a session two tomorrow from 1 o'clock to 2 o'clock in the afternoon, Japan time. So without further ado, let me introduce Ms. Kanae Doi, the representative of Human Rights Watch Japan, who is kindly co-organizing this event.
Thank you very much, Kihara-Hunt sensei. Hello, thank you to each and every one of you for being here with us today. I am Kanae Doi, Japan Director of Human Rights Watch. I am very pleased to be able to welcome those of you who have been with the University of Tokyo and the Human Rights Watch for a long time now, as well as those of you who are new to us. At the outset, I would like to express my sincere appreciation to the University of Tokyo's International Law Training and Research Hub team, led by Professor Ai Kihara-Hunt, for their outstanding and dedicated efforts in making this first ever symposium on a Magnitsky-style law in Japan come true, and all people who generously helped to make this event come together. For many, the name Magnitsky has become synonymous with individual sanctions that states can impose for gross human rights violations in other countries. But it is also important to remember the individual human tragedy, the story of prolonged suffering and death of Sergei Magnitsky that inspired the laws behind these sanctions mechanisms. Magnitsky, a tax advisor, had alleged that various government officials were involved in a massive scheme that defrauded the Russian government of US $230 million in taxes. Russian authority arrested Magnitsky in November 2008, and he died in prison in pretrial detention a year later, following acute pancreatitis and other serious medical problems for which he was not treated. In his honor, the United States passed a law in his name in hopes of preventing other cases of serious human rights violations. In the following years, more and more countries, including the United States, which expanded its law to cover abuses in other countries, hence the name Global Magnitsky, and then Canada, the US, the EU, and others have adopted Global Magnitsky-style laws. These laws allow governments to impose targeted sanctions, including asset freezes and visa bans on individuals anywhere in the world responsible for committing serious human rights violations or acts of significant corruption. Sanctions are specific, targeting individuals rather than entire governments for abusive and unlawful behavior. The laws have received widespread support across the political spectrum. Here, I would like to note one thing. Beyond the politics of sanctions, there are human lives that have been torn apart and people who should be held accountable. Let's look at the case of the Democratic Republic of Congo. In December 2016, the EU imposed sanctions against individuals who played a key role in political repression there. Behind the sanction was the story of the pro-democracy activist Carbon Beni, who had spent the 4 days naked in a dark Kinshasa jail cell before being beaten by 6 soldiers. The commander of the elite Republican Guard told him, "If you want to go free, tell the media that you are now ready to work with the president." Luckily, he survived and still active in pro-democracy movement. Myanmar is another good example where Japan should be able to impose Magnitsky-style sanctions. After the February 1st coup, the United States, the United Kingdom, and Canada imposed expansive new sanctions on the leadership of the Myanmar military. Myanmar military. As many as 100 pro-democracy activists have been killed and 1,000 arrested, many of who have disappeared. And then there are the atrocities against the Rohingya, which killed thousands and forced 750,000 to flee to Bangladesh. About 600,000 Rohingya remain in Myanmar in Rakhine states, subject to government persecuted and violence, confined to camps and villages without freedom of movement, and cut off from access to adequate food, healthcare, education, and livelihoods. The oppressive conditions imposed on the Rohingya amount to the crime against humanity of persecution, apartheid, and severe deprivation of liberty. These stories remind us of the preciousness of each individual life and dignity, and of the need for strong and coordinated international efforts to keep and nurture them. However, unfortunately, in Japan, there has been no discussion on a Magnitsky-style law for a long time. But finally, last year, when the severe repression in Hong Kong escalated after the Chinese government announced that it would impose the draconian national security law, some Japanese politicians, under the leadership of parliamentarian Shiori Yamao and parliamentarian Gen Yamatani, who are also joining the panel discussion tomorrow, started the discussion in the Japanese Diet about the need for a Japanese version of the Global Magnitsky Law. The discussion at the Japanese Diet is still at its early stage, and I hope that the lively and meaningful discussion at this event will help to advance the arguments for passing a Magnitsky-style law in Japan and beyond. I urge the Japanese government to join other countries with similar laws, which will enable Japan to send a strong message to abusive leaders everywhere that there are far-reaching consequences for their actions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Kanae-san. So without further ado, if I could invite Mr. Bill Browder, who is the global push for Magnitsky Law, and he is this American financier and political activist, CEO of Hermitage Capital Management. But more importantly, he's the one who revealed the large-scale corruption in Russia and pushed for Magnitsky legislation to be enacted in the US in 2012, where all of this started. It's the first one in the world. And he's now heading the global movement in Magnitsky Law, and we are very lucky to have him to address to a Japanese crowd. So without further ado, please, Mr. Browder.
Thank you very much for that introduction, and thank you, Human Rights Watch and Tokyo University and all who are joined here in talking about this important subject today. And I also want to thank my friend Irwin Cotler, who's going to come right after me, who's been my partner at every step of the way in fighting this battle for Magnitsky laws around the world. And Baroness Helena Kennedy, who I believe is also going to be joining us, who has been my stalwart ally in the UK. I think it's probably, we're going to be spending a lot of time in this symposium talking about technical aspects of the law. And I'd like to start this whole conversation by giving you the story of how this whole thing came about. And to do that, I want to tell you who I am and who Sergei Magnitsky was, and just bring you into the human side of the story, so that you understand what has driven me for the last decade to make this my life's work. So as you can hear, my accent is American. I was born in Princeton, New Jersey. I was brought up in Chicago, but I come from an unusual American family. My grandfather, Earl Browder, was the general secretary of the American Communist Party in the 1930s and 1940s. He ran for president against Franklin Roosevelt in 1936 and 1940. He was imprisoned by Roosevelt in 40, pardoned in 41. He was expelled from the Communist Party in 1945 for being too much of a capitalist. And then he was persecuted viciously in the 1950s for being a communist. So this is my family legacy. I was born in 1964. And when I was going through my teenage rebellion, as many of us do, I was trying to figure out a way of rebelling from this family of communists. And I came up with a great idea, which was to put on a suit and tie and become a capitalist. And I became a capitalist. I went to Stanford Business School, and I graduated business school in 1989, which was the year that the Berlin Wall came down. And as I was trying to figure out what to do with my life, I had an epiphany one day, which was that if my grandfather was the biggest communist in America and the Berlin Wall has just come down, I'm going to try to become the biggest capitalist in Eastern Europe. And so that's what I set out to do. I originally moved to London, and then I moved to Moscow. And I set up an investment fund in Moscow. It was called the Hermitage Fund. It was it eventually became the largest foreign investment fund in the country. And what I figured out early in the process was that all of the companies that I was investing in were basically being robbed through corruption by these people known as the Russian oligarchs. And as I was trying to figure out what to do about it, I realized that I didn't have many tools at my disposal. There was no law enforcement system in Russia. The court system was corrupt. The regulators didn't regulate. But I had one thing going for me, which was that I knew how to do research, and I had a good team of people on my staff who knew how to do research. And I also knew a lot of the foreign correspondents in Moscow because we all went to the same restaurants and socialized with each other. And so I started this process where we would research how the corruption took place. We would do these, what I call stealing analysis of Russian companies. And once we figured out what was going on, and what was going on was truly remarkable. I mean, the amount of graft was off the scales. We would then take our research and share it with the media, with the Financial Times, the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, etc. And that set off a whole interesting chain reaction. By publicizing these scandals, it had some political impact because many of the scandals took place in companies that were relatively important for the economy. And it was interesting because I started doing this roughly at the time that Putin had come to power. And when Putin had come to power, he wasn't the same overt monster that he is right now. He was kind of an unknown at that time. And he had one huge problem, which was that the oligarchs had basically taken over the country, and the presidency was only sort of a symbolic job. There was no real power of the presidency. And so Putin's objective when he first came to power was try to bring the the power back to the presidency away from the oligarchs. So here I was getting ripped off by the oligarchs, and here he was getting ripped off by the oligarchs. And I've never met Vladimir Putin up until today, never had a conversation with him. But when I first started doing these naming and shaming campaigns, we had this alignment of interests, Vladimir Putin and I. And they say, your enemy's enemy is your friend. And so for a brief period of time, whenever I would publish my research into the stealing, Vladimir Putin would step in and he would use his power, whatever limited power that was, to crack down on these oligarchs. And it was quite an extraordinary thing for me because every time he would do something, the value of my portfolio would go up. And so I was feeling quite good about Vladimir Putin at the very beginning of this whole process. But then Putin decided to do something which changed everything, which was he decided that he wanted to win his war with the oligarchs. And so to do that, in 2003, Vladimir Putin arrested the richest oligarch in the country, a man named Mikhail Khodorkovsky, who was the owner of an oil company called Yukos. He arrested him off of his private jet in Siberia. They brought him back to Moscow, and they put him on trial in Moscow for tax evasion. And when you go on trial in Russia, they put you in a cage. And so the Russian authorities put him in a cage and allowed the television cameras to come into the courtroom and film the richest man in Russia sitting in a cage. Now, imagine you're the 17th richest person in Russia. You see the richest guy sitting in a cage, and what do you want to do? You want to make sure that you don't sit in a cage yourself. And so one by one, the oligarchs went back to Russia, and they went to Vladimir Putin and said, Vladimir, what do we have to do to make sure we don't sit in a cage? And Putin said 51%, not for the government or for the presidential administration, but for himself. And at that moment, he became the richest man in Russia, and I would venture to say the richest man in the world. Now, I continued with my naming and shaming campaigns even after this happened, but instead of naming and shaming the oligarchs, his enemies, I was naming and shaming the oligarchs, his business partners. And it didn't take them very long to figure out that they needed to do something about me. And so in November of 2005, after living in Russia for 10 years and being the largest foreign investor in their country, I was stopped at Sheremetyevo Airport. I was frog marched down to the detention center of the airport by 4 heavily armed border guards. I was locked up in the detention center for 15 hours. And then I was eventually taken back to an Aeroflot plane, put on that plane, deported back to London, and declared a threat to national security and never be allowed back into Russia again. At this point, I realized that when the Russians turn on you, they don't tend to do so mildly, they tend to do so with extreme prejudice. And so I organized for an emergency evacuation of all of my staff and all of their dependents. I got all the people out. And then we quickly and quietly liquidated all of our holdings in Russia so they couldn't seize our assets. And I thought that was the end of the story. Well, it turns out it wasn't. It turns out that 18 months later was the beginning of the worst nightmare you could ever imagine. On June 4th, 2007, as I was sitting in a hotel room in Paris, I got a frantic call from the one last remaining employee I had in Russia, who was a secretary sitting in our Moscow office. And she told me that there are 25 police officers that have just raided the office. At that point, I called my lawyer, an American lawyer in Moscow named Jamison Firestone. I said, Jamie, there's 25 police officers raiding my office. What should I do? And he sounded quite distracted and agitated. And he said, I'm not sure. There are 25 police officers in my office looking for your documents. Let me get back to you. The documents they were looking for were the stamps, seals, and certificates, the official documents of our investment holding companies. Those documents were held at the law firm's office. The police seized those documents. And the next thing we know, we no longer own our investment holding companies. The companies, at this point, I should remind you, were empty because we sold everything, but they didn't know that. So using the documents seized by the police, the companies were fraudulently re-registered out of our name into the name of a man who had been convicted of manslaughter and let out of jail early by the police to put his name on these documents. So I was scared, not for economic reasons, but for legal reasons. And I went out and hired the smartest lawyer I knew in Russia in order to try to figure out what was going on. That person's name was Sergei Magnitsky. Sergei Magnitsky was 35 years old. He worked for the American law firm Firestone Duncan. He was the head of their tax practice. And I asked Sergei to figure out what was going on. He went out and conducted a multi-month investigation and came back with the most remarkable finding. He said that the people who stole your companies didn't do so, or well, their first attempt was to steal your assets, but because you had taken your money out of the country, they didn't get your assets. But their second thing that they did was that when we sold all of our shares in the previous year, we had a huge profit. We had a profit of $1 billion. And on that profit, we paid $230 million of capital gains tax. And what Sergei then told me was that the people who stole our companies went to the tax authorities on the 23rd of December, 2007. And they filed an amended tax return to say that our companies hadn't earned $1 billion the previous year. They earned zero. They made this case with all sorts of forged documents. And they said, therefore, the $230 million of taxes that was paid in the previous year was paid in error, and they wanted it back. So they applied for a $230 million tax refund 2 days before Christmas in 2007. It was approved and paid out the next day. It was the largest tax refund in the history of Russia, paid out on Christmas Eve in one day on a fraud. Now, Sergei and I were convinced this must be a rogue operation. Vladimir Putin is the kind of person who we thought wouldn't tolerate his own government officials stealing nearly $250 million. And so we figured if we just brought it to the right level of attention, then the good guys would get the bad guys, and that would be the end of the story. And so at this point, we filed criminal complaints with all of the different law enforcement agencies in Russia. I went to the TV, to the radio, to the newspapers to expose the story. And then Sergei gave sworn testimony to the Russian State Investigative Committee, which is their version of the FBI. And we then sat back and waited for the good guys to get the bad guys. Well, it turns out that in Vladimir Putin's Russia, there are no good guys. 5 weeks after Sergei testified against the police officers who conducted the raid, the same police officers came to his home on the 24th of November, 2008, arrested him, where he was then put in pretrial detention, where they began to torture him to withdraw his testimony. He was put in cells with 14 inmates and 8 beds and left the lights on 24 hours a day to impose sleep deprivation. They put him in cells with no heat and no window panes in December in Moscow, so he nearly froze to death. They put him in cells with no toilet, just a hole in the floor where the sewage would bubble up. They would move him from cell to cell to cell in the middle of the night. And the purpose of all this was to get him to withdraw his testimony against the corrupt police officers. And they wanted to force him to sign a false confession, to say that he stole the $230 million, and he did so on my instruction. And they thought, here's the guy who wears a tie and a suit and buys Starbucks coffee in the morning and sits in a fancy American law firm. He'll buckle and do anything we ask him to do. That's what they thought. But they didn't understand Sergei Magnitsky. He was a man of incredible integrity. And for him, the idea of perjuring himself and bearing false witness was more painful than any of the physical pain they were subjecting him to. And he refused. And as a result, the pressure and the torture just got worse and worse and worse. About 6 months into this, he started feeling terrible pains in his stomach. He ended up losing a whole bunch of weight, about 20 kilos. And he was eventually seen by a doctor, prison doctor, who diagnosed him as having pancreatitis and gallstones and needing an operation, which was scheduled for the 1st of August, 2009. About a week before the operation, they came to him again and again asked him to sign a false confession. Again, he refused. And in retaliation, they moved him to a maximum security prison called Butyrka. Butyrka is notorious in Russia for being one of the toughest and most horrible prisons in the country. And most significantly for Sergei, at Butyrka, they didn't have any proper medical facilities. So they put him in Butyrka, and his health continued to break down. He went into constant, agonizing, ear-piercing pain from the untreated pancreatitis and gallstones. He and his lawyers wrote 20 different desperate requests to every different branch of the criminal justice system, begging for medical attention. Every one of their requests was either ignored or in many cases denied in writing. And on the night of November 16th, 2009, Sergei Magnitsky went into critical condition. On that night, the Butyrka authorities didn't want to have responsibility for him anymore. And so they put him in an ambulance and sent him to a different prison that had a medical wing. When he arrived at this new prison, instead of putting him in the emergency room, they put him in an isolation cell. They chained him to a bed, and 8 riot guards with rubber batons beat Sergei Magnitsky until he died. He was 37 years old. He left a wife and 2 children. I got the news of his murder the next morning, November 17th. It was by far the most horrifying, traumatizing, life-changing news I could have ever gotten. Sergei Magnitsky died because he worked for me. If he hadn't worked for me, he'd still be alive today. And when I was finally able to clear the fog of hysteria out of my head to think clearly, it became obvious that I had only one choice. And at that moment in time, I made a vow to Sergei's memory, to Sergei's family, and to myself that I was going to put aside everything else I was doing and devote all of my time, all of my resources, and all of my energies to going after the people who killed Sergei Magnitsky to make sure they face justice. And I would have expected that we could have gotten justice in Russia. That's what I hoped. And I hoped from not unrealistically. Sergei had done something very unusual during his time in detention. He wrote everything down that happened to him. During his 358 days in detention, he wrote 450 complaints documenting who did what to him, where, how, and when. And because of these complaints, and he filed every month or so, he'd take a stack of these complaints, handwritten, give them to his lawyer. His lawyer would file them. The Russian authorities would ignore them, but we got copies of them. And so because of this unbelievable collection of evidence that we have, we probably have the most well-documented human rights abuse case that's come out of Russia in the last 35 years. And because of that, I expected some justice in Russia. But that didn't happen. Instead, Putin circled the wagons. He personally got involved in exonerating every official involved in this terrible crime. His government gave promotions and state honors to some of the people who were most complicit. And it became obvious to me that we were never going to get any kind of justice inside of Russia at all. So then I said, if we can't get justice inside of Russia, we should look for justice outside of Russia. But how do we get justice outside of Russia for a crime that took place inside of Russia? And this is when I discovered the failing of the international legal system. There effectively was no proper recourse for this type of thing. Crimes were committed all the time. And if the government of the country that commits the crime doesn't want to prosecute it, then the people who commit these crimes enjoy impunity. And for me, I couldn't live with that. And so I said, we need to come up with a new mechanism. And I said, what should that mechanism be? And in Sergei's case, it became very obvious to me because the people who killed him did it for money. And they don't keep their money in Russia because that money, as easy as they stole it, it could be stolen from them. They keep that money in the West, in British banks and New York banks and French real estate. They send their kids to boarding school in Switzerland. They send their parents for medical trips to Johns Hopkins. And so I said, we do have an opportunity to do something if we can freeze their assets and ban their travel. And so I went to Washington in the spring of 2010, and I met 2 senators, Senator Benjamin Cardin, who was a Democrat from Maryland, Senator John McCain, Republican from Arizona. And I shared with them the same story that I've just shared with you. And at the end of my story, I said, can we freeze the assets and ban the visas of the people who killed Sergei Magnitsky? And they said yes. And that became known as the Magnitsky Act. The Magnitsky Act was introduced in October of 2010. And originally it was just for Sergei Magnitsky. The moment that they put it on the books, all of a sudden, a bunch of other victims from Russia came forward and called up these senators and said, you have no idea how powerful this tool is. You've hit the Achilles heel of the Putin regime. Can you please sanction the people who killed my brother, my father, my sister, my aunt? And after about a dozen of these calls, these two senators realized they were on something much bigger than just one case. And they broadened it, and they added 65 words to the law to include all other gross human rights abusers in Russia. At this point, in the politics of America, there was no daylight between Democrats and Republicans. And it picked up a head of steam, and it went for a vote in November of 2012, and it passed the Senate 92-4. It passed the House of Representatives with 89%. And on December 14, 2012, President Obama signed the Magnitsky Act into law. On that day, Vladimir Putin went out of his mind. In retaliation, he banned the adoption of Russian orphans by American families, which is a horrible thing to do, but it's much more horrible than you can imagine, because the orphans who were being adopted in Russia were only the sick ones, the children with HIV and Down syndrome and other ailments. Americans would take these sick orphans and bring them back to America and nurse them to health. In Russia, if they're not allowed to go to the American families, they tended to die inside the orphanage system before they ever reached the age of 18. And so Putin was effectively killing his own orphans as a way of protest against this American law against his own corrupt officials. He also made it his single largest foreign policy priority to repeal the Magnitsky Act. Now, if his intention was to intimidate the US political establishment, it had just the opposite effect. These two senators, McCain and Cardin, said to themselves, well, wait a second, if Vladimir Putin is getting so upset about this, surely we should do this to other dictators around the world as well. And so that became the Global Magnitsky Act. The Global Magnitsky Act became law in December of 2016. On that day, on the same day, the Estonian parliament unanimously passed an Estonian Magnitsky Act. And then in the next year, and I'm very proud that I'm on this call with Irwin Cotler. Irwin, as you probably know, and if you don't know, you'll know soon, was the Justice Minister of Canada. He was a member of Parliament for many years, and probably the leading beacon for human rights in Canada and for around the world. And Irwin and I had been working together on a Canadian Magnitsky Act. And I'm very proud that, and it was really wonderful, amazing to watch. In October of 2017, the Canadian House of Commons voted unanimously for a Canadian Magnitsky Act. A few days later, the Canadian Senate voted unanimously again for a Canadian Magnitsky Act, and it became a law in Canada, a Global Magnitsky Act. Following that, a month later, the Lithuanian Parliament passed unanimously a Lithuanian Magnitsky Act. In February the next year, there was a Latvian Magnitsky Act. In July of that year, July 2018, there was a British Magnitsky Act. In early 2020, there was a Kosovo Magnitsky Act. And probably the biggest prize of them all was in December of last year, the EU passed an EU Magnitsky Act. So if you add it all up, there are now 31 countries with Magnitsky Acts around the world. The number of people sanctioned is in the several hundreds now by the United States. This morning, the EU announced that they were putting their first Magnitsky list together, and it was going to include Chinese officials involved in the Uyghur genocide. And so now we're trying to expand further. I believe that Up next will be an Australian Magnitsky Act. I spent the last year, and Irwin has been involved with me in this, advocating the Australian Parliament and the Australian government for Australian Magnitsky Act. And it looks like that's going to happen. The Parliament has submitted a unanimous recommendation to the government to replicate the Canadian and US version of the Magnitsky Act. And then here we are today talking about Japan. And let me just say a few words about Japan. Japan is a member of the G7. Japan is one of the most important economies in the world. And if Japan doesn't have a Magnitsky Act, it will be the only important economy in the world that doesn't have a Magnitsky Act. And so at this point, I think it's a matter of sort of responsibility and duty for Japan to join the rest of the civilized world in this exercise. And so I was very glad to start collaborating with members of your Diet on this initiative. And that's my inspiration for coming on this symposium today. And I hope that with what we're starting, the conversation we're starting today will lead to other conversations, and that I can support in any way possible Japan joining in this important initiative. So I think I'm just exactly within my time limit. And so I will now pass it back to the moderator to decide how we should proceed.
Thank you very much, Mr. Browder. We have a few questions addressed to you from the participants and registered participants, pre-registered questions. So one is about the globalization in two directions. One is that you had the Magnitsky Act about Russia first, about Magnitsky first, and then it became a global scope. So how did that change the public's reaction? How did that change the effectiveness of doing something about human rights violations, corruptions? That's one sort of global side. The other global side, another person asks about, is about the global movement. So how did the global movement and having those people on board change your movement on Magnitsky Act?
So originally, this whole initiative became a sort of heated battle, almost so I would say a blood feud between me and Vladimir Putin. Putin didn't want it, I wanted it. He threatened to kill me, he threatened to kidnap me, he issued arrest warrants for me. I've been prosecuted in absentia twice in Russia. And so it was quite helpful, actually, in terms of the effectiveness of this, to globalize it, to say, okay, this is not just about Russia. This is about China. This is about Venezuela. It's about Saudi Arabia. It's about Myanmar. And I mean, that hasn't made Putin any more happy. It's not like he's gotten relaxed about what I'm doing. But what it's done is it's taken away any argument that a politician can make in any country to say, this is an anti-Russian piece of legislation. This is not an anti-Russian piece of legislation. This is an anti-criminal kleptocrat torturer piece of legislation, and it applies everywhere. And I think that makes it an easier, politically easier, and government easier decision to make when making a decision about doing this. And I found when I was working on it in Canada and the UK, that making it global made the whole argument easier, because for anyone who was worrying about upsetting Putin, they didn't have to worry as much. Now, on the other hand, because it's global, we're now upsetting China. And there are some countries, and I would imagine Japan is probably in that category, that are worried about upsetting China. I know Australia is worried about that. And so, you know, I mean, these are the facts of life, that bad people will push back against good people trying to stop them from being bad. I don't think that we should be in any way dissuaded from that. The other thing I wanted to say is that, I mean, it's quite remarkable for me to look at what's happened since Sergei Magnitsky's death. I could have never have imagined that his death would lead to this global human rights movement with his name on it. I could have never have imagined that. You know, when I first started this campaign, people in America said there's no way in 1,000 years that we're going to come up with sanctions on Russians. And people in the EU said this is never, ever going to happen. And what seems to have happened, and this is very much a result of it being a global piece of legislation, is that there are no other tools out there. And so every group of victims has joined me in this exercise to say, you know, it's sure, freezing assets and banning visas is not equivalent to prosecuting somebody for torture and murder. And I'll be the first to admit that, and it's not fully satisfying, but it's a lot more satisfying than watching those torturers and murderers freely enjoying their money, traveling the world, and living with impunity. And so everybody, all of us who are victimized one way or the other, now have a tool, something to grab onto. And everybody who's been victimized, when they understand what this tool does, and they understand how angry the perpetrators get, have grabbed onto it. And so we have now truly a global movement. Many people I've never met in my life. When the Australians asked for public contributions to the parliamentary inquiry, they got like 150 of them. I think I met like 3 of the people who contributed. And so it now really has taken on a life of its own. I'm delighted that it has. All I can do is try to steer it in the right direction and try to prevent parliaments and governments from not being ambitious enough or making drafting mistakes. But this is now sort of a live movement that's not being led by me, but it's being led by a force for good that is much bigger than me.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think the related question was from Amishi. That was about centralized system of Magnitsky law. So if there are countries that have Magnitsky law sanctions, but others not, would there be a problem? And is it more desirable to have a centralized Magnitsky system?
Well, in a perfect world, there would be a centralized Magnitsky system at the United Nations. The United Nations would impose Magnitsky sanctions on the basis of human rights abusers everywhere in the world. The problem is that, as everyone here on this call knows, the United Nations is effectively a failed institution. You have countries like Russia and China sitting on the Security Council and vetoing everything. You have countries like Saudi Arabia and Venezuela and South Sudan sitting on the UN Human Rights Council, and so that can't be done at the United Nations. And so what we've done through patchwork is create a Magnitsky Act in every country where we can. And we try to harmonize them so they all have the same abilities, and they don't at the moment. So for example, the EU cannot sanction people involved in corruption, whereas Canada and the United States can. Some countries like the Estonian and Latvians just can do visa bans, not asset visas. In the end, we want all these laws to be harmonized, and we want these countries to effectively form a Magnitsky summit every year or every quarter to try to sanction the same people together. That's an ambition for the future. It's not going to happen right away, but I would say that if we look at who's now doing this, it's almost all of the what I would call civilized rule of law countries. You have the United States, you have Canada, you have the EU, you have the UK, you soon have Australia. I think New Zealand will join Australia, and then you have Japan. And so, what are you missing in that constellation? You're missing the countries of Africa, of Latin America, but I would consider most of those countries, perhaps all of those countries, as non-rule of law countries where people aren't going to be striving to keep their money safe. And you also have Southeast Asia, same thing. It's not like bandits from Myanmar are trying to keep their money in Mexico. That's not where people keep their money. And so I think if we get Japan and Australia, we pretty much have the civilized rule of law, property rights countries covered. And we have a pretty strong coalition. And then it requires the governments to work together, and they are already starting to work together. It's again early days. It's in its infancy, but I've met with various foreign ministers of the countries that have Magnitsky Acts, and they have every intention of trying to harmonize these things. And so I think we're going to see more and more of that.
Thank you. Another question came from Janice. She asks, you have submitted over 250 names for listing under Magnitsky law, but some were listed and some were not. So what is the reason? Is it because of the amount of evidence or something else?
Well, so we wanted to get every single last person who was involved in the Magnitsky case sanctioned, and we have about 50 people. So if you look at the US, the total US Magnitsky and Global Magnitsky, it's about 300, somewhere between 250 and 300 people and entities. And so we have about between, let's say, 15 and 20% of all the people sanctioned are in the Magnitsky case. I think that the US government basically said, you know what, we have to draw the line somewhere. And so I think 50 is a pretty good number considering what's happened. It's a good question. Why not the rest? And the answer is we have evidence for every single last one of those people, but there just wasn't the appetite. I mean, I'm very frustrated to say today, just today, the EU announced their first Magnitsky list, and there's no Magnitsky killers on that list at all. That's something I'm going to correct, but it's very frustrating indeed.
Okay, the other question came from another person, anonymous person. That is about the complementarity of Magnitsky law sanctions to other human rights movement and other justice system. So how do you, what's the assessment, how well these Magnitsky sanctions are complementing other human rights movement and other justice mechanisms?
Well, so it's really important to point out that if a country can prosecute people in their own country for human rights abuses, then there's no need for sanctioning those people who committed those abuses. So if someone commits a terrible crime in, I don't know, Saudi Arabia, and Saudi Arabia prosecutes them properly for that crime, then there's no need to sanction that person. The problem is that in countries like Saudi Arabia, the Crown Prince was, for example, involved in the ordering the execution of Jamal Khashoggi. The United States just came out with that information. And because he's the Crown Prince, he will never be prosecuted. And so because he's not going to be prosecuted, that's the purpose of the Magnitsky Act, which is to create some type of justice. Now in the West, what other types of justice are available for these types of things? There's a concept called universal jurisdiction. And I studied this very carefully to see whether that could be applied to Magnitsky's killers. Universal jurisdiction says that if a crime is committed in one country and it's so heinous, it can be prosecuted in another country. And there are various countries where universal jurisdiction sits on the statute books. But I've tried and failed at getting countries to use this in the Magnitsky case, and I know many other people have tried and failed in other cases. It's almost impossible to find almost every country's law enforcement is saying, why should we care about some crime that took place in another country when we have limited resources and limited bandwidth and we're trying to prosecute crimes in our own country? And so that's the main method for finding justice. The International Criminal Court exists, but it only works in a very, very small number of cases where there's a huge number of victims. And even then, it doesn't work at all if you have a situation like China, where China can effectively veto it. And so we really, I mean, I would argue that there are no other serious mechanisms for justice that exist. I wish there were. I wish that we could come up with more. I wish the world was a more just place, but that's why this piece of legislation is so valuable.
Okay, I think last question is following up on that one. So there was a comment actually on the Magnitsky implementation. So Magnitsky implementation is discretionary and not mandatory. So wouldn't Magnitsky law have the same limit as other justice system?
Yeah, I mean, and so it's interesting because in the U.S. there was one big difference between the Russian Magnitsky Act and the Global Magnitsky Act, which is in the Russian Magnitsky Act, it said the president shall sanction those people who did X, Y, and Z. In the Global Magnitsky Act, it said the president may sanction people who did X, Y, and Z. And we were very upset with the difference between shall and may when we were advocating for the Global Magnitsky Act. And so, but in the end, and this is a very ironic thing, the Trump administration has sanctioned hundreds of people on, and very robustly used the Global Magnitsky Act. Now, you wouldn't think of Donald Trump as being a big human rights guy, but people in his administration were very much using this legislation. So but ultimately it comes back to the discretion of a government. And I can use another example, and maybe Irwin can talk about this for a moment in his remarks. But the Canadian Magnitsky Act, which was passed in 2017, they immediately sanctioned a whole bunch of people, including Magnitsky's killers. And then they added a few more people for Jamal Khashoggi, and they added some people involved in the Rohingya genocide. And then since 2018, they haven't sanctioned a single person. And that comes right back to the question, which is it's a discretionary thing and it can be used or not used. All this means is that activists and people like us have to embarrass, put pressure on, find allies in parliament and in government and make things happen. Nothing ever happens by itself. And so it really does require a continued push all the time.
Okay, thank you very much for this very detailed information about how Magnitsky law came into place, and also comparing global Magnitsky law. That is a very good foundation for us to start our conversation. And we are very grateful that you are staying for the panel discussion where we can probably address some other issues that are coming up right now. Thank you very much. And